Hello everyone and welcome back to the Dr. Medic channel. My name is Justin and today we are revisiting the Vanderbilt LifeFlight helicopter crash that occurred on November 8th, 2025 near Lebanon, Tennessee. Now when I covered this accident the first time, we had very limited information. We had the ADS-B data, the flight behavior, and a few early details really. And I did speculate then that this accident appeared consistent with a pilot medical emergency. Now, the NTSB preliminary report is out, and while it is still subject to change because the final report won't be published for probably another year or two, it does confirm that this accident did in fact involve a pilot incapacitation situation. Full update coming up on this episode of the Dr. Medic. Now, Vanderbilt LifeFlight 1 flying in an H130T2 departed the Gallatin, Tennessee base at about 1:34 p.m. local time in response to a flight request in Rutherford County. Now, about 3 minutes later at 1:37 p.m., the operator's communication center, which in this case is called AirCom, advised the crew that their request had been canceled. Perfectly normal, especially for scene flights to get canceled. It costs money to do this, but many flight services allow ground crews to kind of preemptively request the helicopter and then cancel them if the patient, obviously doesn't require the helicopter. Like I said, it costs money, but it can save quite a bit of time on scene flights. Anyway, shortly after they are canceled, they make this 180-degree turn back toward Gallatin while cruising at about 4,000 feet mean sea level, which for this area is about 3,000 feet above the ground. Then at 1:39 p.m., AirCom received a radio transmission from the aircraft that is absolutely incredible. And the transmission stated, "AirCom, LifeFlight 1, we have a medical emergency on board with our pilot, and we will advise." No further radio transmissions were received from the flight after that point. But that call alone obviously tells us that this was not a mechanical issue, there was not a weather issue, and this wasn't just a routine return to base. Something was wrong with this pilot. According to the preliminary report, what followed, in my opinion, is one of the most sobering real-world descriptions of pilot incapacitation I've ever heard of, let alone in an EMS helicopter. Now, the flight paramedics stated that after the cancellation, the pilot did turn the helicopter around, but he didn't give any, of the usual acknowledgments, no nod, no thumbs up, no copy that, RTB, or return to base, didn't say anything. So then the flight paramedic kind of verbally confirmed on his own that they were returning to base, and still the pilot didn't respond. He leaned forward, tapped the pilot on the shoulder, because he's sitting right behind him. And when the pilot kind of looked at him, he described the pilot's expression as a complete kind of blank stare. Eyes open, no emotion, no response, no purposeful movement. Now, the flight paramedic tried repeatedly to continue to get the pilot's attention, and he couldn't do it. He noticed that they were still high, which, like I said, is a great thing, gives you lots of room to solve problems, and that they were, flying in his terms fast. Now, he observed the pilot was trying to attempt to interact with either the GPS or maybe the autopilot, but he was unable, to correctly select any of the buttons or complete any of the actions that he was doing. The pilot's hands were kind of there, but he wasn't making any meaningful control inputs. And so at that point, the flight paramedic unbuckled and leaned forward to take a closer look and see what the controls were doing and realized that the autopilot itself was not engaged. And this is where things get very real very fast. The flight paramedic had never touched the cyclic in flight before. Like, why would he? And normally is not permitted to do so, right? That's not something that they would do. But from years of watching pilots fly, as well as some other stuff that I'll tell you in a minute, he believed that the helicopter needed to slow down. So he placed his hand, the flight paramedic's hand, over the pilot's hand on the cyclic, and the pilot didn't resist, and he kind of pulled aft. He pulled backwards a little bit. Now the helicopter reacted more aggressively than he expected. Obviously, they're so sensitive. So he made smaller inputs to try to stabilize it. He then he had to reach all the way across the pilot's lap and lowered the collective, trying to reduce power and, descend and trying to slow the aircraft. Now, at this point, he was kneeling over the center console, completely out of his normal position, probably kneeling directly on the sled system where the patient would normally be laying down if if they had a patient on board anyway, trying to control a helicopter that he had never been trained to fly. I cannot emphasize what a tight fit an EC-130 helicopter is in the back, especially on the left side of the helicopter. The pilot sits over on the front left, and in this case, I believe the paramedic was actually sitting directly behind the pilot in this chair right here. The flight nurse would have been sitting over here on the right side where you see me sitting here, where you see my legs. And so it's absolutely incredible to think that this paramedic came out of his chair, climbed over this patient's sled, knelt down on the sled here, and reached over this little plastic divider that you see right there and literally flew this thing to the ground. Now, why him and not the nurse who may have had easier access? Because it just so happens that this paramedic is the flight incapacitation guy. Every service has someone who specializes in something. This guy is the guy on the vent, or this girl over here she's the one for airway, or this one over here is the baby expert, is great at the newborns. Well, this paramedic, he happened to be the guy for pilot incapacitation, and he had just recently finished a massive in-service for Vanderbilt LifeFlight on pilot incapacitation. So it's amazing that he is the one that was on this flight when this emergency occurred. Anyway, so the flight paramedic, while he's controlling this aircraft to the ground, he pointed at a field that he thought that would work for the landing. And the pilot, his only coherent response during this entire event was to point toward a kind of a bigger, wider field that was further ahead and said, there, or no, there. And that was it. That was all he said this entire flight. And as they descended toward that field, the helicopter ended up striking the tops of some trees. And then about 10 to 20 feet above the ground, the flight paramedic on his own initiated a hard flare, and the helicopter impacted terrain and rolled onto its left side, causing serious injuries to the flight paramedic and the pilot, and unfortunately killing the flight nurse. Now, in this case, the ELT, or emergency locator transmitter, which seems to never work or be activated in other accidents, it actually worked, and it was activated, and it appears to have first been picked up by the United States Air Force, who then relayed the information over to Air Methods. Rescue crews arrived, and I do believe that both the flight paramedic and the pilot were then flown on other helicopters to a trauma center on other helicopter services, with at least one of them being Air Evac Life Team. Now, to add tragedy to the story, forgive me if I mispronounce the name, but Michael Atzert, one of the Air Evac Life Team pilots who flew one of these injured crew members out, he died about a week after this helicopter crash while driving his own vehicle into his base in Kentucky. It's absolutely tragic. Now, there are several extremely important points here that absolutely cannot be ignored. First is the lack of a post-impact fire. This was an EC-130T2 model, which comes from the Airbus factory with a full crash-resistant fuel system. Not just a reinforced fuel tank, but crash-resistant lines, fittings, and all the components throughout the entire system. And this matters. This helicopter rolled over. It was under power. The rotors had their rotor energy. They hit trees at speed. And without a crash-resistant fuel system, this accident very likely looks completely different at the end. In my opinion, without that system, there is a very real chance that this helicopter erupts into a massive post-impact fireball. And if that happens, the odds of the pilot and the flight paramedic surviving drop dramatically, if not obviously to zero. Now, that system almost certainly played a role in the fact that there was no post-impact fire and that 2 people were able to survive this crash. And why do I point this out? Because not every air ambulance operator in this country has invested in those systems, and there are still medical crews out there now flying around in A-Star 350s and EC-130s that do not have a crash-resistant fuel system and are extremely prone to suffering a post-impact fire even after a possibly otherwise survivable hard landing or crash. Second is kind of the automation. The flight paramedic stated that the autopilot itself was not engaged, and this distinction kind of matters. But that does not necessarily mean that the helicopter was flying completely raw. Now, a helicopter like a Bell 206 or some 407s or an AS350 or EC-130s, especially the older models, historically, they don't come from the manufacturer with any form of stability augmentation, let alone a full autopilot system installed. It would either have to be a newer model or an aftermarket add-on installation, such as with the Genesis Helisas system, which includes a stability augmentation system, otherwise simply just known as SAS, that can remain active even when full autopilot modes are not. Now, not to get too deep into this, but with all those helicopters that I just mentioned, they are helicopters that require the pilot to, actively fly the helicopter the entire time. They are constantly making small adjustments and flying the helicopter. Now, normally they cannot just let go of all the controls and leave it that way, because the helicopter would become completely unsettled and would kind of tumble out of control within a matter of seconds without any inputs being made. You can't really, without a SAS system or some form of stability control, you can't just let go of the controls on a lot of those helicopters and have the helicopter still fly straight. So one of the main advantages of SAS is not just that you can activate an autopilot mode, such as a heading or an attitude hold. It's that at any time, if the pilot just lets go of the controls, the helicopter will return to normal and level flight. Now, this is a big deal and a massive investment made by many of the largest operators around the world. Now, in this case, Air Methods, and this helicopter had that system. So now the main point that I'm getting at with the automation is that normally in a helicopter without this type of HeliSAS system, within seconds of this pilot becoming incapacitated, this helicopter most likely would have tumbled out of control, rolled over to the right or something like that. But with the HeliSAS system installed, even without one of the autopilot modes activated, the SAS part, the stability augmentation part of the system, will still stabilize the aircraft, which is giving this paramedic the opportunity to react and manipulate the controls to try and save everybody on board. In other words, even though the autopilot system wasn't flying the aircraft, underlying stabilization may have been buying just enough margin to keep the helicopter controllable during an absolutely chaotic situation. Now, there is another piece here that I think is critically important to talk about. Vanderbilt LifeFlight has a well-known and fairly in-depth pilot incapacitation training program across their fleet, which includes EC-145s, EC-135s, and of course this EC-130. Now that matters because without that training, without the mindset that pilot incapacitation is something that can actually happen and that the med crew can even do anything about it, I think it's possible and probably likely that this outcome would have been much worse. Now, I'm not saying this paramedic wasn't able to just jump in the pilot's seat and function as a competent pilot or something like that, but what he was knowledgeable enough about the controls and the systems of this helicopter to be able to manipulate the controls in a manner that got this helicopter on the ground and allowed at least 2 people to survive. Now, in the EC-135 and the EC-145 specifically, those 2 airframes, you typically have a medical crew member seated up front, and if there's not a patient on board, to the pilot's left, with relatively easy access to the controls and the displays and all of the automation. That configuration gives you a lot of options, but the EC-130 is way different. There's no front medical crew seat, there is no other chair, and there's only one seat in the front of this helicopter, and the pilot is sitting on the left side, which is unique to this helicopter as well, with the collective on the left side, which was originally designed kind of ironically to keep passengers on tour flights from inadvertently manipulating the collective. In this case, the paramedic was still able to reach over and manipulate it, which is amazing. And yet, even in that configuration, a medical crew member was able to slow the aircraft, influence its trajectory, and help get it on the ground. And in my opinion, the pilot and the flight paramedic are probably alive today because of a combination of these 3 things. Investment in pilot incapacitation training, investment in crash-resistant fuel systems, and investment in systems like the Genesis HeliSAS that may have helped keep this aircraft stable just enough for the paramedic to do his thing. Now, take any one of those things away, and I think this accident looks very different. That being said, there is one uncomfortable question that it just can't be ignored. I'm so tired of ignoring the big elephants in the room. While all of these investments likely played a role in preventing further injury or death, which is amazing, awesome to everybody who paid for those investments, but having 2 pilots would have most likely prevented this accident from occurring in the first place. Now, if one pilot becomes incapacitated and the other pilot is present, this flight continues, the aircraft lands, and nobody crashes, nobody dies, and most of us probably would never even know that this situation occurred. The problem, of course, is feasibility and money. Are there 2-pilot helicopter air ambulance systems in the United States? Yes, there are. Are they common? No. Are they expensive? Absolutely. But that doesn't mean the conversation shouldn't happen. It's able to work in other parts of the world. That doesn't necessarily mean it can work here, but it's certainly a discussion that we can have. And it's probably a topic for a future episode. But it's a topic that this accident should force us to all at least acknowledge. I also want to address one final point clearly, because I read a bunch of stuff online. This aircraft was operated by Air Methods at the time of the crash, but Vanderbilt has since announced that LifeFlight flight operations will be handled by Metro Aviation beginning right around now, early 2026. I just want to emphasize that that agreement was signed and planned before this accident occurred. It was not in response to this crash. It's important to be clear about that. As I said before, man, I am heartbroken and devastated for the Vanderbilt LifeFlight family, all the flight paramedics, nurses, and pilots and mechanics and everybody involved. It's terrible. It's terrible. But I also believe it's important to acknowledge the flight paramedic who was placed in an unimaginable situation and made decisions under extreme stress that very likely saved lives. This investigation is not over, though. The final report will still take time, but even this preliminary information reinforces something that the air medical community cannot afford to ignore. Pilot incapacitation happens. Training matters, equipment matters, and sometimes the difference between everybody dying and someone surviving is whether an organization chose to invest in safety before the accident ever occurred. To every flight crew out there, y'all stay safe, take care of each other, and keep doing amazing things.